So liberation and sacrifice. These themes are often linked. Both of them are important themes in the human life journey. They are both themes linked to the two major spring holidays in our culture, Passover and Easter. While many members celebrate Passover or Easter in their own ways, as an ethical culture community, we as a whole don't celebrate them specifically as a group. What we do honor is how the various spring holidays represent some of the many attempts human beings have made to celebrate life, to understand life, and to communicate some truths about life. I'm going to speak for myself this morning as a humanist. Others within ethical culture may see it differently. When I look at holidays, including ones like Passover and Easter, I see them in their historical context as products of human creativity. I see them as about myth. But by myth, I don't mean simply a mistaken idea or outright untruth. The word myth is sometimes used, though, for that larger meaning, the sense in which myth is more than just a made-up story. Through a myth's telling and through its incorporation in the community life of people, a myth embodies lessons about human life and purpose. And that is how I use the word myth this morning. Myths take their richness from how they resonate with human experience. And like human experience, myths can be interpreted differently by different people and in different times. One factor that makes a story into a myth is that it is meant not simply as an illustration, but as a kind of recreation of human experience. To take a myth as truly a myth, you don't simply listen to it and hear it, you participate in it. In Christian churches today on Easter, they are not saying simply, once upon a time, long ago and far away, Christ rose from the dead. They use the present tense. Christ is risen. In Passover Seders this last week, the words were not simply, people long ago were slaves and then they won their freedom. No, the words are more like, we were slaves in Egypt and now we are free. In every generation, look on yourself as if you came forth out of Egypt. In a Passover Seder, participants eat the unleavened bread that the Hebrews ate in their flight. They taste the bitter herbs and thus the bitterness of the plagues. In Jerusalem, in Rome, in many of the churches, Christians act out again the stations of the cross, reproducing and taking part in the journey of Jesus's last days. They participate. These are some of the strongest myths that remain in our culture. Those of us who have left or never been part of these true traditional religions, we don't participate in the myths in the same way. We can still look at the myths as products of human creativity, human creations that tried to teach lessons for living. Some of them are useful inspiration to any of us, just as inspirational for lessons as might be Hamlet or Walden Pond. So I'm going to start with Easter because here in the US culture, it is the more dominant of these two myths. For a believing Christian, Easter is the most important, most Christian holiday of the year. For the Christian, it is central to their faith that Christ was resurrected, the empty tomb found on Easter morning. Different sects interpret differently what that central idea means, though. Some concentrate on the suffering of Jesus. I think of the Roman Catholic representations where Jesus is still suffering on the cross. Well, most people experience some suffering in our lives. Few of us get nailed to crosses, at least not literally. But in the early days of Christianity, such levels of suffering were more likely. In few religions does the deity suffer. The suffering of Jesus brings out the humanity in this particular deity. As theologians interpreted this story over many years, a Greek and Roman more abstract idea of an infinitely perfect God replaced the Hebrew personal and national God. And thus was added this abstract God to the idea of a suffering human side of Jesus. What they reasoned out was that if God was infinite, then the suffering also had to be infinite. The suffering that Jesus came to represent was at a level beyond any human suffering. The story was then reinterpreted to bring in the concept of infinite sin by humanity, represented by Adam and Eve, that then required an infinite sacrifice by God in order to counterbalance. This model of sacrifice, I think, has not been a very healthy one. It has given humans a model of infinitely sacrificing self for others, a total devotion to giving. I think here of Patricia Nixon, who said once, "I have sacrificed everything in my life that I consider precious in order to advance the political career of my husband." How sad. Everything that she considered precious. Too often, others are sacrificed for the sake of the more powerful. Frances Beale in 1969 wrote an essay on the topic of to be Black and female. In that essay, she identified a turning point of sacrifice, the point that differentiates the healthy sacrifice that is an important part of the human life journey and the unhealthy part that sacrifices others for the sake of the few. She wrote, "To die for the revolution is a one-shot deal. To live for the revolution means taking on more difficult commitment of changing our day-to-day life patterns." Beale was part of the Black liberation movement and the women's liberation movement. And the healthy kind of sacrifice is linked to true liberation, while the unhealthy kind of sacrifice is linked to subordination and oppression. Like change so that the climate can be healthy for human life. That is an important, healthy sacrifice. And do it now, now, now. Because sacrifices that have been demanded are often unhealthy, the word often carries a negative emotional weight, especially for those of us who believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. Sacrifice is often asked of us, not chosen by us. When sacrifice is linked to the issue of liberation, it can carry far more positive meanings. In ethical culture, we center the concept of a social existence in which our actions influence the lives and the actions of others, in which we believe that our acts do make a difference beyond our own selves. So in ethical living, we want an acceptable giving from the self that does not give our own self away, does not give ourself into the hands of another to control so that we lose our autonomy, or give it beyond what we are able to and choose to give. Well, there's another newer view within Christianity, liberation theology. These are words from a leader of liberation theology, Leonardo Boff, who was talking about what Easter means to him. It means committing oneself to building a world in which it will be less difficult to exercise love, peace, fraternity, openness, and self-surrender. This entails denunciation of situations that engender hatred, division, and unbelief in the realms of structures, values, practices, and ideologies. It entails proclaiming and realizing through committed behavior love, solidarity, and justice in the family, the school, the economic system, and political relationships. Such commitment has as its consequences crises, confrontations, sufferings, crosses. Now, notice how he turns to that feature I talked about a myth, how we participate in it, don't just talk about it. So, back to Leonardo Boff. Such commitment has as its consequences crises, confrontations, sufferings, crosses. He goes on to accept the cross inherent in that struggle is to shoulder the cross, enduring and suffering for the sake of the cause and the life we have chosen. Well, Boff is clear, as we should be, that to commit ourselves to love, peace, community, openness often means facing the reality that these will involve us in confrontations and conflicts, that we will sometimes suffer for the sake of our ideals and others. We don't have to accept a Lord or a Jesus or a literal cross to understand the message that he's getting out. Myths of Easter are, though, for many of us, far away and part of what we or our families rejected. So I'll suggest another model of healthy sacrifice that is closer to human daily life, prior to and more basic than any religion can be. And that is the bearing and nursing of infants. Some people take on the responsibility to bring a child into the world, give over parts of our bodies, do give up some level of control over our physical existence to an unknown potential and yet to become person. When the child is born, we nourish the child for the sake of the child. While there is always a lasting physical effect on the bodies of those who bear children, and while there was a considerable risk of death or major injury from childbirth for most of human history, and still there is some risk, people still choose and often chose to have children, to nurse them, to nurture them. That is a kind of sacrifice. It is one that sometimes has meant the opposite of liberation, as social mores for much of history limited women's public and family roles because of our role in bearing and nursing children. We still see lawmakers try to limit choices around childbearing. The movement to give women more choices has been called liberation. But this movement has, except for minor exceptions, not been about abandoning the physical role of childbearing and nourishment, but about having more choice and about sharing the emotional and physical care of children as much as possible. Our language is still about giving birth, giving. This act of giving, when by choice, does not totally give up self. The one who bears a child needs to remain a person, independent of the child, in order to truly nurture the child through childhood to adulthood. The child, in turn, is liberated slowly, first in that sudden act of birth, then bit by bit as the child becomes a separate and independent person, and finally another adult. In the acts of childbearing and nursing are embodied quite basically the interdependence of sacrifice and liberation. The linking of birth images to the Easter story is not new. At the time Christianity was developing, many of the mystery religions of the Greek and Roman cultures had a ritual that involved a ceremonial kind of dying or a sacrifice, going to the underworld and rising again reborn. For example, the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, where the daughter is kidnapped to the underworld against her choice, and the mother pursues her while the earth dies in winter. The daughter comes forth reborn in spring. The Easter myth also embodies that same cycle of death, the time in the underworld, and the rebirth or resurrection. Christians on Easter participate not only in a sacrifice of Jesus, but in the rebirth. Those who participate in the hope of new birth and new growth. So another connection, in English-speaking countries, the word Easter likely derives from the name of the Sumerian goddess Astarte, one of those goddesses the Hebrew prophets warned against worshiping. The goddess Astarte was linked to the spring festival, and she was often represented in antiquity as a hare, a rabbit, that laid the egg of the moon. The egg, of course, is a near universal symbol of birth and is linked to many spring festivals, including Passover, where spring eggs are boiled in salt water which represents in many, many myths the waters of the womb. The link between Passover and Easter is strong. While the myths out of each of them are quite different, the holidays are closely connected. In the Christian books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and again in a letter from Paul, The meal shared by Jesus and his followers that came to be called the Last Supper is identified as a Passover Seder, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The sharing of unleavened bread and wine on the first night of Passover came into Christianity as the sacrament of the Eucharist, the center point of the Mass. Easter has roots in ancient spring festivals. Passover has roots too in ancient spring festivals, combining two older festivals. One among shepherds, in which the month of lambing began with a ritual sacrifice of one of the lambs, with the blood smeared on the doorposts of the tents. And another spring holiday among farmers, who, preparing for the harvest of spring grain, cleared out their old chametz, originally the starter that makes dough rise, as a sign of truly starting over. Scholars think that those two festivals, didn't really get combined until the Babylonian exile, when the desire for liberation as a people would have been deep. At that time, these festivals were linked to the story of the liberation from Egypt, and the book of Exodus was written down in that time from many different oral traditions. The text of the festival's order for a Seder first appeared in the 9th century. Verses were added later in reaction to the anti-Semitism of the crusading period. In the last century or so, many alternative texts have been offered reflecting new streams of Judaism, or non-religious socialist and secular Judaism, the civil rights struggle, feminism, climate justice. The central message of Passover is about liberation, not a liberation of the individual person, as modern humanism and European-based political theory would emphasize, but the liberation of a people. Liberation in the Passover story also requires commitment or sacrifice in response to hardships and crisis and conflict. In our own American national mythologies, the theme of liberation is strong. Think of how the Passover story resonated for people who were enslaved. There's a reason Harriet Tubman in her own time was called Moses. In our own often comfortable lives, we need reminders of how the struggle for liberation often asks of us sacrifice. Have you ever wished that you could commit yourselves more fully to your ideals? That you could make the commitment to work for your own liberation, for the greater liberation of humanity? So listen to this as we hear an ethical humanist version of the Passover narrative. This one is adopted from Alla Renee Botzart. And let me find the slides here. Check nothing. Oops, we have to go back here. Peck, oops, it's not all here. Never mind, we're going to ignore that. Peck nothing, goes the reading. Bring only your determined to serve and your willingness to be free. Don't wait for the bread to rise. Take nourishment for the journey, but eat standing. Be ready to move at a moment's notice. Do not hesitate to leave your old ways behind. Fear, silence, submission. Only surrender to the need of the time, to love justice and walk humbly. Begin quickly before you have time to sink back into old bondage. Set out in the dark. There will be fire to warm and encourage you. You will have dreams in the desert to guide you safely home to that place you have not yet seen. You are going into the wilderness to make a new way and to learn more deeply. Some of you will be so changed by weathers and wanderings that even your closest friends will have to learn your features as though for the first time. Some of you will not change at all. Some will be abandoned by your dearest loves and misunderstood by those who have known you since birth and feel abandoned by you. Some will find new friendship in unlikely faces and old friends as faithful and true as the pillar of flame. Sing songs as you go. You may at times grow confused and lose your way. Keep telling the stories. Make maps as you go, remembering the way back from before you were born. So you will be only the first of many waves of deliverance on these desert seas. It is the first of many beginnings. Remain true to this mystery. Pass on the whole story. Do not go back. One advantage of a humanist attitude toward myth is that we don't have to take it exactly as it was originally written. We can ignore the parts that we find offensive and dangerous, follow the paths that lead to peace and love and justice, and add to the myth what needs to be added. One example of this is what Phyllis Berman and Arthur Vascow in 1994 wrote of an addition to the Seder. They write, when Susanna Heschel spoke of equality for Jewish women, a man rose angrily to say, a woman has no more place in leading prayer than an orange has a place upon the Seder table. And so today, in many homes, an orange is placed on the Seder table, a fruit that bears the seeds of a growing future. And the orange is eaten as part of the meal. For myths, at their best, are alive. And as humanists, I'm fine with remaking them to tell the story that the myth needs to tell. By remaking myths, we are doing what humankind has always done. We are choosing the narratives, the powerful stories, the myths that tell the truth of our lives. And so we're going to say goodbye now to those joining us on video. I hope that those on video will join us on a Sunday morning, usually at 11 a.m. Find out more about us at rysec.org.